Hello and welcome to the fifth and final episode of the Commodore 64 Budget Publisher Showdown. Over the course of this series I've been joined by a variety of guests to try and determine which was the best publisher of Commodore 64 budget games between Mastertronic, Firebird and Codemasters, and at the end of this episode we'll finally crown the winner of this competition. Before we do though, let's take a look at the leaderboard and the state of play at the end of the previous episode. Currently in third place with 71 points is Firebird, in second place with 81 points is Mastertronic, and in first place, leading by just 1 point, is Codemasters. So it's not looking good for Firebird, but mathematically they can still win this. It's all to play for as we go into the final 3 rounds. In this final episode, we'll be covering a variety of categories that didn't fit the themes of the previous instalments. With some of the finest games from each publisher up for discussion this time, I've brought in the big guns to help me review them. First, I've brought back one of my guests who helped kick off this series in the first episode, writer for the revived Zap64 magazine and avid C64 collector, Matt Allen.
Hello.
Hi Matt, and joining us for the first time in this series is his fellow Zap writer and another legend of the C64 scene, Andrew Fisher.
Hello.
So Andrew, this is your first time on this series, so would you like to tell the listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself?
Hello, I am Andrew Fisher, known in the C64 scene as Merman, a C64 owner since 1985. My YouTube channel is called Merman1974 after the year I was born, and that's my handle on various social media. I'm a writer, reviewer, composer, game tester and more. I wrote the Commodore 64 book 1982 to 19XX and I'm working on a sequel right now, so check out c64books.co.uk for the latest news. Back in the 90s I wrote reviews for Commodore Format and was Professor Brian Strain in the pages of Commodore Force, as well as contributing to Commodore World and Lodestar. I now write for Retro Gamer, Wireframe, Fusion, Reset, Retro Format, the relaunched Zap 64 and the new Zap Amiga.
Thanks, Andrew. I didn't know you were working on a new copy of the book. I've got the original one, and that's an excellent book. I do recommend it to anyone who hasn't got the Commodore 64 book that Andrew did. It's well worth a read. Okay, so Matt, you did this in the first episode, so there's no need to ask you this again. But Andrew, would you like to share some of your memories of playing and collecting budget games over the years and your general thoughts on them?
There are a couple of games that have been mentioned in this series that I took a chance on and bought without seeing a review first, which was unusual for me, but at a budget price you can't go far wrong, especially when they're as playable as CJ's Elephant Antics and American 3D Pool. Personally, I love the Zeppelin label, in no small part down to the classic Zybex and the later release Arnie, but I have many Firebird, Mastertronic and Codemasters games in my collection and treasure them. Even something that isn't seen as popular, such as Kobayashi Maru, the excellent icon-driven adventure game by Clive Wilson. But to pick one of my all-time favourites is the Mastertronic re-release of Pathfinder, a truly excellent game.
Yeah, fantastic game. I really enjoyed that when I played it, and I never played that one back in the day, so it was a really good one to find when I was working through the Mastertronic collection. So Matt, obviously you've already shared your thoughts about budget games generally, but I'd like to know, since the first episode when you began this journey with me, what have you thought about the subsequent episodes and some of the scores that have been given to the various games?
I have to say, after the way Firebird stormed episode 1, I thought they might be able to actually hold on to their lead, but evidently not. At the start I did think it would be mightily close, with maybe Firebird edging it overall, but I'm actually a little bit shocked they're that far behind coming into episode 5. Most of the other scores from the other episodes I agree with in principle. However, I will say that having played it myself, 4 Soccer Simulators is absolutely horrendous. I can't stand it in the slightest. I think Raging Beast should have won Sports Other. Quite how Slicks didn't score 9 points, I don't know. And Train Robbers is better than Impossible Mission. I mean K.
Okay, yeah. I think the big shock for most people would be that International Speedway and Slicks shared first place in that driving games round. But there you go. Everyone's opinions are their own, and the fellow reviewers on that episode rated that game quite highly. Personally, I didn't, but there you go. Okay, so before we get into the first round of this episode, with this being the final episode of the series, Codemasters currently have a 1 point lead over Mastertronic, and then Firebird are 10 points behind. But as I mentioned, all 3 publishers could still win this. I've done the calculations and it is possible for Firebird to win this one. So I'd like you both, and I will do so too, to predict a winner for me. Andrew, do you want to go first?
I was fully expecting Mastertronic to win overall. It has so many classics, but then quantity doesn't always mean quality. I did feel Firebird would put up a strong showing, with Codemasters unable to keep up. If there were more re-releases under consideration, then the Ricochet label and Firebird's Activision titles would have been neck and neck.
Well, we may get onto that particular subject in this episode. In fact, we will. So Matt, what do you think? Who's going to win this one?
Based on how I know I'm going to vote in this episode, actually, I think it's almost impossible to definitively call still. As you say, Firebird can still win, but I suspect they're going to be the very close third place finisher.
And who do you think is going to win overall then?
Mastertronic, I think, possibly, but yeah, I think it's really flip a coin time.
Yeah, I do think it's going to be really close, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that actually Codemasters are going to finish last overall based on the games in this episode. I think Mastertronic will still win it, but I think Firebird are going to have a really strong showing. But that's just my opinion based on my thoughts about the games, and obviously we need to get yours as well. So let's start by moving on to our first round this time around, which is round 14 overall. Round 14 is puzzle games. These are all different kinds of puzzle games, anything that involves some kind of brain power to solve the levels. There's not really a common theme between these three games, but representing Mastertronic is Mind Trap, representing Firebird is Brainstorm, and representing Codemasters is Steg the Slug. So we'll take a look at Mind Trap first. This was a Mastertronic release from 1989, costing £1.99. The game was coded by Branislav Tomic with music from Vojislav Mihailovic. Coloured cubes have been scattered all over a floor, and your objective is to shuffle them around until the screen contains 6 neatly colour-coded columns of cubes. Stack the cubes up so they align vertically with the colour markers at the bottom of the screen, but don't hang around. There's a time limit on each level, and you've only got a finite number of moves in which to get everything neatly in place. I could only find the one review for this game in the magazines, and that came from Commodore user who gave it 66%, saying it's definitely one for the brainier types. Shoot 'em up addicts need not apply. So let's start things off in this final episode with you, Matt. What do you think about Mind Trap?
Mind Trap was, I think, the only game out of the 9 we're looking at here that I hadn't actually played before, so it was a completely new experience for me. As you say, not many places seem to review it. I certainly didn't remember seeing it in Zap, which is probably why it didn't trigger any recollection for me when I saw it. So I booted it up, had a read of the instructions. It seemed right up my street, and it is, but it's not a very easy game to play. It's a very strong puzzler, and it really does take an awful lot of logical deduction to be able to solve the puzzles. There are thousands and thousands of levels apparently, and you start it up and you think, you're starting out, you get, level 1, you might get 3 colours to be able to rotate and get them in the right order. But no, the level starts out and you're using all 6 colours, and I'm looking at that thinking, this is a bit of a tough start. Needless to say, I sort of worked through it and completed it, and the next few levels all seem to be substantially easier than the one that started it all off. So I got several levels through the game, and I probably got up to, about level 30, 40. Certainly by the time they introduced the second floor that you're able to go between and have to line up that way as well. And I did enjoy it, but it would have benefited enormously from having a much easier and graduated difficulty curve to get people into the game. You kind of slap straight into it, here you go, try and solve it, and you're left staring at the screen thinking, okay, how am I doing this? It's got some basic graphics, nice colourful dice, and all in all it's a pretty nice puzzle game. It just could have benefited from a bit of a polish up and a tweak and a better playtesting experience.
Yeah, I'd agree with most of those comments, but what do you think of it, Andrew?
Well, in terms of that first level, as Matt says, you're immediately thrown in at the deep end with all 6 dice, and you have to get them in a particular order. And once you understand that first puzzle, it's much easier to get further into the game. And it comes with a password system, which is based on your name and then a long string of characters, so you can pick it up and play another game. It's an unusual and quirky game that looks quite simplistic at first, but once you get into it, there is some merit in how it plays, and as Matt says, the later levels where you have more than one floor really start to tax the brain. Would I go back and play it a lot? No, I don't think so. There's a lot of better puzzle games on the C64, but it's certainly an interesting and novel release for a budget label.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I quite like this one. One thing I have to mention about it is the title screen's got some pulsating text on it, and I felt like that was going to trigger a seizure in me if I watched it for too long. It just pulsated at a range that really kind of got to me. Apart from that, the title screen's quite good. It's got some options and reasonable music on it. As you mentioned, the graphics are very simple but functional for a puzzle game. That tune that plays, it took me a little while to recognise it, but it's Lionel Richie's Running with the Night, which is quite a good tune actually, from late 70s, early 80s. I'm not sure sure exactly when it's from. It's not a brilliant rendition of it, but it does seem to fit the game quite well. I think it did get annoying the more you heard it though. And you're right, this has got, apparently according to the instructions, 999,999 levels, which possibly makes it the best value for money game ever made. I'm not sure you'd ever play through them all. And I feel like they must be procedurally generated in some way to fit that many levels into it, or some very clever programming. It's a pretty good puzzle game, like you said. It's fairly casual. It's one of them you could play a few rounds of and then put it down and then come back to it, because it's got those crazy long passwords, which I feel like they must meet the encryption standards for modern times. They're so long. I mean, can you imagine finishing a level and not sure if you're going to complete the next one, so you wrote the password down and then you get to the end of the next one and you have to do it again? It's like you'd soon run out of notepaper to write them down on. Back in the day, obviously not such a problem nowadays, because you could just take a screenshot, a photo or whatever of them. But yeah, I do like the fact that it combines your own name, your score and your progression into that password, so that password is sort of unique to you to continue the game. That's quite clever. As you've mentioned, it is quite complex, and it certainly gets more complex when there's multiple floors to work through, but they are all solvable and the time limit's pretty generous, so you do get a good sense of achievement and progress with the game. And it does get a bit boring after maybe 10 or 15 levels, but because you've got those passwords and the huge number of levels, I think you could come back and continue playing where you left off, and that's a really nice feature for it. So I was quite fond of this one the first time I played it, back when I was reviewing it for my Mastertronic series, and playing it again, I really quite enjoyed it.
Take that, Sentinel, and your 9,999 levels.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they make a note in the instructions saying they could have done 1 million levels, but they stopped at 999,999. I wonder if anyone's ever played through them all. That would be quite an achievement.
I wonder how long that would actually take you to do.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they're not short, are they? It's definitely a few minutes per level at least, so...
Absolutely, the time limit, as you said, is quite generous on each level, but then you start to feel a little pressure as you rotate them, doing that thing where you have to rotate one into a group to then rotate it out again at the right place.
I thought it was very Rubik's Cube-like.
Yeah, it felt like a mixture between a Rubik's Cube and a sliding tile puzzle in that sense, particularly when it gave you limited paths where you could move along. So you had the sections where there was the central circle where you could rotate round, but you couldn't then rotate outside those circles.
Yeah, absolutely. It was certainly an interesting game. I think it was Eastern European in origin, I think. So yeah, another interesting puzzle game to come from the eastern part of Europe along with Tetris.
It was kind of appropriate, perhaps, the inlay artwork for the sleeves, a copy of Rodin's The Think.
Yeah. Okay, so that was an interesting start to this round. Let's move on to the next game, which was Brainstorm, released by Firebird in their Silver Range packaging in 1987, costing £1.99. This one was created by Pete Cook and David Kirby. The object of the game is to trap 1 or 2 bouncing balls on a red area of the grid, since your score will depend on the time the ball spends travelling over each particular coloured area of the screen. Move the pointer onto the playing area and press fire, and the line you've selected will move across the grid to the position of the pointer. Each screen is played against a time limit, and in order to complete a screen successfully, your finishing score must be greater than your score on finishing the previous screen. This is another one that didn't receive many reviews from the magazines, but the one review it did get from Zap was certainly very complimentary. They gave it a score of 94% and said it's an immediately compelling and fiendishly addictive addition to the puzzle genre. This was also released as a free cassette on Computer and Video Games, issue 88 in 1989. That's where I actually first came across this. I remember buying that magazine because it had a tape on the front, and it included the Commodore 64 Spectrum and Amstrad versions all on one cassette, so that was quite a nice thing. And I would say that this game, much like the previous one, Mindtrap, doesn't look that much. It's not very spectacular in the graphics stakes, but gameplay wise is really good. It's got a concept that's a little bit sort of got elements of Pong and maybe even kicks a little bit, but it's a completely original game as you have to surround the balls and trap them in the coloured areas to increase your score. You've got the risk reward where you can just get the ball into a large area with some red, or try and trap it with one of the other lines into a smaller space and boost your score. You've also got the ability to double your score by pressing the bonus button. I would say some levels are a little bit unfair. You've got the green sections that teleport you, and they're really large, and it's almost impossible to trap the ball in an area that will definitely score you points. So that is a little bit unfair on a couple of the levels. And I'd also say that the cursor control, obviously quite unusual for this point in time, and it's probably a little bit slow using a joystick. I feel like this game was probably ahead of its time, because it definitely would have worked better with a mouse, and even could have been like a mobile touchscreen game. It's got over 20 screens though, and 3 difficulty levels, so there's plenty of challenge for your money, and the ability to start on any level is good for variety, so you don't have to start at the beginning every time. Overall, I rated this number 2 in my Firebird top 10 original games. I think it was an absolute bargain for $1.99, and even more so if you got it free on the magazine like I did. So those are my thoughts on Brainstorm. Matt, what are your thoughts on it?
Oh, this was an interesting one to come back to after quite a long time, I must admit, because I played it an awful lot back in the day. It was one of those that I bought off the back of the Zap review. 94%, it's a budget game, it's £2. How can you go wrong? And I utterly loved it. So much so, I think I actually got through the entire game and completed it, at least on the easiest difficulty level, if maybe not the middle one. So coming back to it now was an interesting experience, and it took a little time just getting used to the controls and the logic. But eventually it was, like riding a bike, really. It just sort of came back to you saying, okay, this line goes there, that line goes there. You want the ball here, the ball's going on the red. Let's increase some score. Let's not lose some score. Let's get to the next level. And yeah, I just really loved it again, because it's an action puzzler that you've got different ways of being able to complete the level. You're not set to one fixed solution. It's down to both your strategy and your timing, and a little bit of randomness from the ball bouncing around and what area of the screen it happens to hit at the time. And there's enough levels to keep you interested, but not too many that it outstays its welcome and you start to get bored trying to get towards the actual end of the game. So yeah, I came back to it, and my opinion on it didn't change compared to 30 years ago when I was originally playing it. I just loved it again.
Yeah, it's definitely a game that still stands up. The graphics, as I said, not up to much, but it doesn't matter because the gameplay is spot on and it's just as playable now as it was back in 1987 when it was first released. Andrew, what are your thoughts on this one?
This is a really clever game and one I do like. I had this on the CMVG cover tape as well, so that's an interesting little piece of synergy there. I personally like the pointer interface. I think it's a nice way of controlling the game, although, as you say, sometimes it feels a little slow when you're moving because it's got an acceleration beat built in, but then you can tweak those controls a little in the options. It is very finicky with the ball bouncing around sometimes, and you feel like you've got it trapped, but you're just a pixel or two out and it hits the wrong part of the line, and bam, your score is ruined. But I did come back to it a lot. I played many of the levels and got a long way through it myself, and playing it again for this roundup, I still love it. I think it's a very well made game.
The cursor control is definitely good, I think. It's a good way to play the game. I just felt it was a little bit slow moving it around with the joystick. Like I say, I think a mouse would have been better. And there was a mouse for the Commodore 64, I'm sure, but I don't suppose it supported that.
There was more than one type of mouse
Yeah.
for C64. You can also get a mouse that pretends to be a joystick.
Ah, well, that would be very useful in that game then. Perhaps I'll track one of those down. Okay, well, positive thoughts about Brainstorm. So let's move on to the final game in this round, which is Codemasters Steg the Slug. This was released in 1992, and by that point, budget games were a little bit more expensive. This one cost £3.99. The game was coded by Nick Taylor with graphics from Jason Brazil and music from Ashley Hogg. Steg the Slug has to look after his family, and to do this he must feed them. You control Steg by making him slither around the walls, and he can also blow bubbles. It's by doing this that he captures the grubs which he needs to feed his family. Be careful, as the bubbles will burst on contact with any sharp object. Once all your family are fed, they'll happily fall asleep and you'll move on to the next level. I found a couple of magazine reviews for this one. Commodore Format gave the game 76%, but the best review came from Zap, who gave it 87%, with one reviewer saying, just like Bob Monkhouse, Steg is slimy but highly entertaining. So Andrew, do you want to start us off on this one? What do you think of Steg the Slug?
Well, for me, the most memorable thing about this was the wipe clean scorecard that they gave away with Commodore Format. I'm not a big fan of this game. I think the graphics are very murky and unclear at times, and the controls are really awkward. You never really feel like you're in full control of it, particularly when you're trying to climb up the walls. It is a very challenging game, and at times I didn't enjoy it simply because of the controls. What does help is the password system, allowing you to get back to a level you've got to later in the game. And I suppose there is an element of the cute in it, the big-eyed babies and the way you can see that you're doing well by the number you've saved, but by the same token, it can be a bit heart-wrenching when you see the baby start to die. As I say, I'm not a fan of this. It's not one I enjoyed going back to this time around, and I wouldn't have paid for it back in the day.
Interesting. I was expecting a more positive review of it from you, but I feel quite similar in some respects. I do think presentation-wise, this is a lovely looking game. It's got a really nice cover art, and the animated title screen with Steg the Slug moving around on it is nice as well. It's got music as well, and as you say, it's got the password system, so it's good for skipping the earlier levels. And then when you get into the game as well, the player sprite's really cute, and it's got good animation on the little grubs that are moving around, and the chungans are they called? They look really nice as well. There's a lot of brown on the level, which obviously the Commodore 64 detractors will be picking out on this one, I think. It's got reasonable sound effects in game, and it's got some tunes between stages as well, so that's good. For me, the gameplay's a bit like Lemmings, really, in that you've got to kind of direct the grubs to the exit, or in this case, the babies, to eat them. I found it really tricky to get the hang of blowing the bubbles to begin with, and then eventually, once you work out when to release the blowing so that you form a bubble, it's just a matter of timing to get the grubs. It's fairly simple to start with, but it does get harder as the levels progress, with bridges to switch on and spikes that you have to switch off as well. There's some power-ups in it, like a jetpack and bionic legs, but they don't really seem to add much to the stages I've seen. But to be honest, I only got through the first 4 stages, and then I couldn't get past the 4th one, so I probably didn't see the best of the game, perhaps. Ultimately, I just found it a bit boring, though, just trapping the grubs and sending them upwards. It just seemed a bit endless on some levels, where you just kept doing the same thing over and over again without really seeing much of the benefit of it, because most of the time you can't actually see the grubs arrive at the babies where they're eaten. It would be better if you could scroll the screen or get around it more quickly to see the full level, I think, or maybe have smaller layouts to begin with to ease you into the game, but also to let you see sort of the fruits of your labour. So I probably haven't seen the best of this game. As I said, it probably does get better as you get more into it, but I just found it quite dull. Never got past level 4 and didn't really feel any inclination to try after a couple of attempts. I know a lot of people like this game, but I wasn't particularly impressed by it. How about you, Matt?
Yeah, colour me one of those people who do like the game. I can't remember exactly why I bought it. It was probably off the back of the Zap review as well. And you load it up, and yeah, you got a very nice title screen and a really, really, really nice title piece of music. And you get in, and yeah, level 1's not heart-wrenchingly difficult once you know what you're doing, and you work out the levels and you get around. As you say, you disable any of the traps that you meant to get there, and the bubbles, and get the grubs, and you slowly make your way. I can't remember how far I originally got in the game back when I had it. I suspect probably around level 4 or 5 that you said, Matt, and I think there's 7 levels in total. So yeah, I think it possibly got, just a little bit too difficult and frustrating by that point to warrant repeated play trying to actually get past it. More like trying to bang your head against a brick wall when the grubs aren't doing what you want them to, and they accidentally run into something that kills them off, as you say, a bit like Lemmings. Sometimes these things are outside of your control, and it's oops, and you really want a button that just blows everything up and starts again. Which you could do in Lemmings, but you couldn't in Steg the Slug. Probably be the equivalent of dumping sort of entire salt factory on the level to blow it up. Certainly know my father would approve getting rid of all the slugs on his lettuces in the garden. It's a tricky one to call nowadays. I think there are some design flaws as part of it that are a lot more evident now that I'm older, with a lot more gaming experience compared to when it originally came out. But I still like it as a game. Did it deserve the original scores Zap gave? Possibly, sort of in the mid-80s. It's not an instant classic, but it's a pretty playable title that, would appeal to quite a few people in general.
I can see what they were aiming for, but I don't really feel it ever got that close to being a good game for me. As I say, I don't particularly like the graphics. I think the brown is the least of the problem. It's the greens and the greys that are a bit too close to each other, so you can't always tell what you're looking at.
It could be worse. It could have been asking you to differentiate reds and greens. Hello, colourblind people, like our colleague Christian.
Yeah, interestingly, just going back to Mind Trap, I wonder if that's why all the different coloured dice have a different number on them, so that if you were colourblind, you could still work out which ones you need to put in a row.
Yeah, the thought had crossed my mind on that one as well.
Yeah, because that would be a very forward-thinking thing to do back then. Okay, well, thanks very much for your thoughts on these 3 games. Let's move on to the rankings for this round. So 3 puzzle games, very different puzzle games. So what we do is rank these from worst to best and give them points accordingly. Andrew, do you want to go first with your rankings for these 3?
Yes, with 1 point, we have Mind Trap from Mastertronic. It's a very interesting puzzle, but just too quirky and ultimately the weakest game in this selection. With 2 points, we have Steg the Slug from Codemasters. I'd much rather play something like Bubble Ghost or the much later DS game Soul Bubbles if I want to blow bubbles. And finally, with 3 points, the silver medal winning Brainstorm. Absolutely the best game in this selection and still a fantastic puzzler.
Thank you very much. Matt, how about you? What are your rankings?
Well, I'm going to concur with Andrew there. Mind Trap's fun, but ultimately repetitive in its gameplay, despite the -1 levels that are on offer, so that gets 1 point. Steg the Slug gets 2 points, and Brainstorm the top with 3 points.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I've got a very slight difference of opinion. I think these are all pretty decent games and all definitely playable. But for me, Steg the Slug was the least playable of the three. Very good to look at for sure, in my opinion, but I found it a bit dull. So I'm putting Steg the Slug third. Second, I'm going to give to Mind Trap. This one's not very good to look at. It's quite dull and it's also quite repetitive. But the fact that you've got that huge value for money of all those levels, and it's a game that I did quite enjoy playing the first time around and I enjoyed returning to as well, that puts it in second place for me. And in first place, concurring with you both, definitely the best of the three games in this round is Brainstorm. Again, pretty dull looking game, but a very unique and clever idea and really well implemented as well. That's the first round over, and let's have a look at the overall scores for that first round. So in third place, we have Mind Trap with 4 points. In second place, we have Steg the Slug with 5 points. And in first place with 9 points and a perfect score, it's Brainstorm. So Firebird take the first round and almost immediately push themselves back into contention, I would say. So that was the puzzle game round completed. Let's move on to round 15. And this round is different from all the others in as much as this round is all about re-releases. So all the publishers re-released games that were originally published either as full price games or by other publishers. Codemasters much less than the other two, but certainly Mastertronic and Firebird, a good proportion of their releases were re-releases, and a lot of them were by a company that we're going to see two games from in this round. So first up from Mastertronic, we have Ghostbusters. From Firebird, we have Park Patrol, and from Codemasters, we have Pro Boxing Simulator. So we'll begin with Ghostbusters. This is a re-release of the 1984 Activision game, based on the famous movie, of course. This was released by Mastertronic in their Ricochet packaging in 1988 at a cost of £1.99. It was designed and programmed by Activision legend David Crane with music from Adam Bellin. Hundreds of ghosts are making their way to the infamous Spook Central. Only you can save the world from a disaster of biblical proportions by making your way to the top of the Temple of Zool. You can only do this when you've captured a large number of ghosts, made more money than you started with, and survived the constant dangers on the streets. The original release of the game received countless positive reviews from the magazines in 1984, but I have found a review of the re-release from Commodore user in 1988. A short review gives it 8 out of 10 and says it's all good fun and is without doubt the best re-release around. Zap never reviewed the game when it was first released, nor the budget version, but they did review it in a 1992 feature about games based on movies, and they gave it a score of 40%, saying the design of the game was crude, which I have to say is exceptionally harsh. So, Ghostbusters. Who am I going to call to talk about this one first? It's Andrew.
Well, this is a stone cold classic. It's one of the first games I ever played on the Commodore 64. I borrowed it from a friend at primary school and rushed home to play it at lunchtime, and then didn't have time to load it, so I had to wait until after school. What can I say about this? It is a superb game designed by David Crane and based on an unfinished project he had. Greg Fish back at Activision did an amazing job of picking up the license before people knew what a hit Ghostbusters was going to be. I just love everything about this game. It's so cleverly made. You are not actually playing the part of the Ghostbusters, you're setting up a Ghostbusters franchise in your city. So that extends to setting up a bank account and then choosing your own equipment. There are so many clever touches, from vacuuming up the roaming ghosts to the Keymaster and Gatekeeper meeting to the marshmallow alerts where you have to deal with the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, the very tricky piece at the end where you have to try and get into the Temple of Zool, and a superb ending sequence. Of course, what many people remember about it is the sampled speech and the sing-along lyrics on the title screen. As I say, one of the first games I played on the C64 and still very playable, particularly if you have a code giving you a bit more cash to start with when you can afford some of the flashier items, and yeah, one I'd still go back to and play a lot.
Yeah, that is a great touch once you've completed the game once or finished the game, whether you've completed it or not, and you get the account number to get access to more money so that you can buy the bigger vehicles and things like that. What do you think of this one, Matt? Are you a fan of it as well?
Yes, like Andrew, it was also one of the first games I actually played on my 64 after my parents got the computer for me in 1984. So it's one of those foundation games that laid down the principle of, hey, you've got something that's better than the kid next door to you who has the Spectrum, with the colourful graphics, the great title track and the speech. As Andrew mentions, David Crane created the game out of a half-finished car project he was actually working on. He'd got some way in creating the map and driving the car around the actual map, and that's about as far as the game had actually got when the license came in. He then completed the rest of the game with everything in 6 weeks. Normally they took their time over things at Activision, but they wanted to get the game out to time with the film actually coming out at the cinema. And, you know, either the pressure or David Crane's genius, everything came together so well. You're not just playing the game, you're actually playing the film. You're doing everything that happens in the film. You're going around, you're capturing ghosts, you're having to make sure your PK levels don't rise too fast, otherwise you're not going to earn enough money to get past your starting amount. And it's definitely one of the better film licenses that are available, not only for the 64, but just for any computer in general in the 80s.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with most of what you said, but a couple of things I wanted to mention. This was the top-selling Mastertronic Commodore 64 game. Despite it being a re-release, it sold over 147,000 copies on the C64. That's not even counting the other systems it was released for. So that's pretty amazing when you'd have thought most people would have already played the game the first time around. Like you, this was one of the first games I played on the Commodore 64 as well, but in this case, I played it on a friend's Commodore 64, probably in about 85, I think. It has got a really good recreation of those key sort of moments from the film, busting the Slimer and the Marshmallow Man and all that kind of thing. But as you said, Andrew, it's also just like a Ghostbusters job simulator. You know, you're actually setting up your own Ghostbusters business and going out and busting ghosts. And people might say that's a bit repetitive and boring to just keep driving out, catching the ghosts and going back to base to put them in the storage facility. But it doesn't really get boring for me. It's just so much fun, certainly back in the day and even now, to just drive around, catch the ghosts, and keep doing that until you get to the more sort of climactic moments of the game. The bit where you kit out the car at the beginning is always fun as well, because you've got a bit of freedom of how to spend your money. Little things like that are all just really nice touches that make it individual to you each time you play as to the sort of strategy you employ. Graphics and sound all really good for the era as well, 1984. I think the graphics recreate the action from the film pretty well, and the speech is obviously a brilliant addition. I think we all loved the speech back then on any games, but especially speech from a movie was really good. So yeah, like you say, Matt, it's one of the best movie adaptations on the C64 for sure, and just on any system. I totally agree.
One of my favourite touches is the way, if you don't buy the infrared sensor at the start of the game, you can't see the ghosts on the capture screen as well as if you've got it. And that just shows how well David designed the game and understood not only what would make a good game, but also then the limitations and hardware features of the Commodore 64 to use the sprites to really give that atmosphere of, hang on a minute, you're trying to deal with these ghosts and they can be difficult to see.
And you need the vacuum cleaner to be able to suck up the ghosts while you're driving, because every ghost that escapes you on the road adds another 100 to the PK meter. So there's a reason for all the bits of equipment that you need to put on. So if you're trying to sacrifice things, you really need to sacrifice the number of traps rather than some of the other equipment. Otherwise, the energy levels go up too quickly you to be able to earn enough money.
Yeah, like you say, everything's really well thought out. Another thing I wanted to mention is that this re-release version, the Ricochet version, also had the Invader load as you were loading. So it was even better value. You actually got 2 games for your £1.99, a brilliant movie adaptation and a Space Invaders game as well.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, very positive thoughts about Ghostbusters from all of us, unsurprisingly. So let's move from one Activision re-release to another, and the Firebird offering is Park Patrol, originally released by Activision in 1984, re-released by Firebird in the Silver Range packaging in 1987, costing £1.99. This one was programmed by Tony and Go with the music composed by Russell Lieblick. There's trouble down at Papa Toto Park. The old keeper has had a nervous breakdown and the place has gone to the dogs. You're invited to take up the challenge of becoming the new man or woman in charge of the park. As park ranger, you'll be equipped with a raft, snake repellent and a few morsels of nourishment. Your task is to clear the litter up, watch for swimmers in distress and keep the park wildlife in line. Zap were highly complimentary of the game, giving it an overall score of 94%, calling it an original, attractive and extremely addictive game, with all the qualities of a full price game for only £2. Another reviewing Computer Gamer said Paw Patrol is one of those games that's so simple to play and so incredibly addictive that you wonder why you didn't think of it yourself. At under £2 as well, it puts many of its more expensive brothers to shame. They gave an overall score of 78%, which I'd have to say doesn't really reflect those comments. Okay, so this is one of my all-time favourite Commodore 64 games from any publisher. It's really simple in essence. You drive around the park in your boat, you pick up the litter and you rescue the swimmers and you avoid a few enemies. But it's got so much depth to it the more you play it. There's loads of little secrets you can exploit for bonus points. You soon learn that you've got to go into the hut to top up your energy, otherwise you're going to run out of energy and lose a life. I suppose the most sort of iconic thing about it that you learn as you play the game is the log rolling, which you can get loads of bonus points for. So it's got all that arcade game style to it where you're playing for a high score and you've got little secrets that you can exploit to get those higher scores. There's so much going on in the game as well, it can become quite frantic at times, balancing all the tasks from rescuing drowning swimmers, disposing of snakes, getting the food back from the ants and collecting the bottles and cans and things like that. The graphics are cute and full of character. It's got catchy tunes with a different tune on each stage for the first 5 stages at least, and it's got sound effects too, which is not something you got necessarily on all Commodore 64 games. It was quite often one or the other. And then on top of all that, you've got the fact that you can customize every screen, so you've got almost endless replayability from it, from being able to adjust the number of different enemies there are on a screen, and also of course the choice of the male or female park ranger, which is a brilliant touch, which is completely unnecessary. Nobody would have complained about it just having a male park ranger, but it's all the better because you've got that choice. Obviously back then there weren't that many games that were sort of geared towards female players, so the fact that you could choose a female player instead of a male one is just a lovely little touch that makes this game all the better because of it. It's really original, it's charming, it's addictive, it's an absolute classic for me, and it was never sold at full price in the UK, so this Firebird budget release is just an absolute bargain at £1.99. Anyone want to argue with those points?
Well, I'm certainly not going to argue with those points. I'm going to add a few points of my own. The budget re-release obviously comes with a superb tape loading screen by Paul Doherty, which is unique to that version. The setting itself is so beautiful. There's some subtle parallax effects going on with the graphics, with rocks in the distance and trees in the distance moving at slightly different speeds to give the impression of a much larger scrolling landscape than you actually see. There's the subtle waves on the water, and you mentioned the sound effects. I think there's some really clever sound effects in there, using some clever settings in the SID chip to give the waves lapping, the snakes hissing as they come near you. So yeah, there's so many little touches in the game that I really enjoyed the first time I played it, and again it's a game I can go back to and play endlessly. As you mentioned, the options menu is a very unique thing for a game like this. You can go in and adjust the settings, make it slightly easier for yourself, or even if you wanted to, make it harder by adding more ants to the first level or reducing the number of the snakes on the third level. But once you get beyond level 5, then it goes back to some set settings that gradually increase per level. And the thing is, you can become very proficient at this game by learning where the rubbish is going to be in relation to the hut, where the swimmers are going to be, because they're generally near the hut. They don't stray too far from it, although there's subtle differences in the game again that just keep you on your toes and make it worth replaying.
Yeah, absolutely. Some points there that I didn't even think of that just make it even better. So Matt, any other thoughts on this one?
Not massively, I will say. Paw Patrol is one of those games that I have no idea why Activision didn't actually release it at full price in the UK. I don't know whether it's because the setting, you know, it's a park ranger, it's a very American idea, whether they thought it wouldn't fly outside the US or not. Like both of you probably, I picked it up on the strength of the review in Zap on budget. I fell in love with it. It's a beautiful little game, and you know, it's worth more than $1.99 easily. So much so that I went out and got the original version on disc at some point, which apparently is actually quite hard and valuable to get nowadays. Hez in Australia actually released the game on cartridge as well, so I've got a copy of that. So I've got 3 copies of the game, and there's not a huge amount to add over what both of you have said. There's so much to do on each level that you're never short of something that you're going to have to do, either pick up rubbish or, you know, dispose of the ants or the snakes, rescue the swimmers. One thing that neither of you have mentioned is that there's a particular bush that you can touch on each level, and eventually it'll grow big enough that it gives you a fruit that renders you invincible for about half a minute. I think you get it on level 5, so you can basically run around just absolutely decimating all the wildlife if you want to. the feeling of power before then coming back down to earth again. So yeah, that's another hidden thing that you've got to discover for yourself by playing it. And yeah, there's so much depth and so much variety, and just all those little touches just make a brilliantly beautiful little game that, yeah, I have no idea why it didn't see a wider release back when it was originally out.
I'm going to say something quite strange here in that I don't actually own this on the Silver range, or like Matt, gone out and bought an expensive version on cartridge or disc. The only place I actually owned this was on the Chartbusters compilation, which was £10 for 30 different budget games from Firebird and Mastertronic. So that's about 30p for what I consider one of my favourite Commodore 64 games ever.
Yeah, I actually played it on the Chartbusters compilation when I was a kid as well for the first time. My friend and I think we split the cost of it between us, and we spent a couple of days over the summer holidays playing every game on that compilation. And there's absolutely no doubt that along with Ghostbusters, which is also on that compilation, Paw Patrol was one of the games we enjoyed the most. Okay, so that's 2 Activision re-releases. Now let's move on to the Codemasters one, and this is called Pro Boxing Simulator, although it was originally called By Fair Means or Foul, originally released by Superior Software at full price. It was then repackaged as Pro Boxing Simulator, and it was released in 1990 by Codemasters, costing £2.99. The game was coded by Jason Benham with music from Robert Westgate, and unsurprisingly it's a boxing simulation for 1 or 2 players. In one player mode you'll compete against 6 computer-controlled opponents, and if you beat them all you become world champion. You'll then defend your title against even tougher opponents. Normally you'll use legal punches, but when the ref's not looking you can use foul moves such as kicks and headbutts. However, if the referee catches you you'll lose 1 of 5 lives, and if you lose them all the match is over. In terms of the magazines, Zap did review the original version of the game, giving it 66%, but they also reviewed the re-release and gave it a score of 62%, saying despite very basic presentation and the lack of realism, the game offers simple but appealing action, which is good value at the budget price. The game was also reviewed by Commodore Format, who gave it 39%. Now, there's a little bit of controversy with this one because they originally released it with the packaging saying it was a new release, and so they got pulled up by people who'd already bought By Fair Means or Foul and obviously recognised it as exactly the same game, albeit with a different title screen, and so they had to republish the game with an altered front cover so that it said that it was formally released as By Fair Means or Foul rather than it being a new release. So some Codemasters marketing tactics which have been mentioned in previous episodes, they could be a little bit underhanded at times with the way they promote things. It's also quite controversial in the gameplay is that you can cheat all the way through it as well as actually boxing normally. So with those thoughts in mind, Matt, what were your thoughts on Pro Boxing Simulator?
I think because it was a Superior Software title, I think I possibly played this first on the BBC Micro. We had, like probably a lot of schools in the 1980s, computer room that had BBC Micros, in our case BBC Masters, because hey, we were posh. And therefore we got to play quite a lot of BBC games. And what I think probably happened is that this was one of the games that did the rounds, you know, on copied discs that we'd load up and play when we had a chance during the lessons, and we weren't being told to switch that off and actually do programming exercises. So I suspect I played it on the BBC first, and then I played the C64 version at some point down the line. But it's not Barry McGuigan's boxing, it's not even Fight Night. It's an alright boxing game, but the controls are not intuitive. The difficulty level is sometimes unfair, and some of the hit detection was suspect as well. So, I mean, it's an alright game, but I think compared to the other 2 games that we're looking at in this round, it's way down the pecking order.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. Unfortunately, as I mentioned at the start of this round, very few re-releases by Codemasters, I think maybe only 3 or 4, and this one was probably just about the best reviewed of the bunch of them. But yeah, it's not a particularly good game. It's funny you should mention it about it originating on the BBC Micro. I had a BBC Micro when I was a kid, long before I had a Commodore 64, but I never played this on the Beeb, and I never played it on the C64 until doing this series. But what I did notice immediately when I loaded it up was that the title screen music is the same music that was used on Repton 2 on the BBC Micro, which was another BBC Micro game from Superior Software who did this game as well. So I just found that amusing because I recognised the music instantly. So a couple of things about it. It's got a practice mode, and you need it because the controls are really hard to remember. So I quite like the practice mode, particularly that you can practice headbutting the punch bag and things like that. The graphics fairly average, I think. Lacking animation frames, I noticed as well. There's a lot of places where, like when the guy's celebrating when he's won, his arms are in just two positions and it's all a bit jerky. I found it a bit odd that your first opponent is like really purpley pink coloured. It's like he'd been out in the sun for too long, I guess. I do like the crowd chants and jeers that are sort of speech bubbles that appear in the background. They're quite fun. And as I said, the controls are hard to remember, and I found that instinctively I would hold the fire button and push towards the opponent, but that's actually a kick and is therefore a foul move, and you can immediately lose a life for doing that. And that's the next thing, is basically each participant's got 5 lives, and when you've lost them all, it's game over, and you lose them all either by losing a round or by getting caught cheating. So you can actually lose your lives quite quickly. The ability to cheat is quite interesting, but because you immediately lose a life if you're caught, and there's very few opportunities to comfortably cheat unless the referee's fallen asleep, so generally it's not worth the risk cheating. I just found myself using fire button and up and down for high and low punches to try and register hits, and that was pretty much all I did. It took me a few goes to get past the lowest level opponent, but then when I did, I'd obviously got to grips with the best way to win a match and then got all the way to the 4th opponent, but then I was absolutely annihilated by them. I could barely get a punch in. So as you said, the difficulty level is a bit erratic to say the least. It's kind of an interesting idea, but none of the aspects of it really work particularly well. It's probably more fun in 2-player mode, as a lot of sports games are, but I could have just summed that up by saying what you said, Matt, which is basically it's not got a chance against the other 2 games in this round. Andrew, any difference of opinion from you?
Well, to use a boxing analogy, it feels like it's stepped up a weight division and is trying to take on someone too tough for it. The graphics are pretty ugly, the colour choices at times are very odd, and the controls are not really conducive to enjoying the game. As you said, pushing forwards towards your opponent should really be a basic punch, but it's not. I'd say from a personal point of view, I am a fan of Superior Software. I like quite a few of their games, notably the Repton titles. I also like Bone Cruncher when that got converted to the C64. And while this isn't perhaps the best boxing game on the C64, it has its moments. The cheating is, I think, for me, the best aspect of it, if you can get away with it. I just wish at times there was a bit more variety in there, a bit more in terms of opponent AI that gave you something challenging to try and counter. I do like this one in its sort of quirky, unusual way. It's coded by Jason Denham, who went on to do Quick Snacks, which is one of my favourite Codemasters games. But I just really don't think it's got a chance in this category against 2 Stone Cold classics.
Yeah, I think the big problem is Codemasters did not re-release a game that had originally been published by another company that's anywhere near the standard of the other 2. So on that note, let's get to the rankings then, and it's pretty much a 2-horse race in this round. It's 2 brilliant Activision games that I love and 1 game that's reasonably playable, but it's just not in the same league. So unsurprisingly, my 3rd place goes to Pro Boxing Simulator, and then it's really close between the other 2. I love both of the games, but for me, Ghostbusters is probably a little bit more repetitive in the gameplay than Park Patrol, so I'm going to go Ghostbusters 2nd and Park Patrol in 1st place. Matt, how about you?
I'm going to agree there. Pro Boxing Simulator is at the bottom. Ghostbusters gets 2 points, and Park Patrol yields Firebird another victory with 3 points.
Okay, and how about you, Andrew?
Well, I'm going to go with 1 point for Pro Boxing Simulator. As we say, it's punching above its weight here. And then 2 points to Park Patrol. I found it really difficult to separate these 2 games. Park Patrol, an early environmentally themed game, is a lot of fun. But 3 points has to go to Ghostbusters for the memories and for being such a clever tie-in to the film.
Yeah, and I can't really argue with you too much there. Obviously, myself and Matt rank them differently, but they're literally neck and neck here. It's a photo finish between these 2 games with Pro Boxing Simulator turned into glue, I think. So,
yeah, pretty much. Yes.
So what that means for the results for this second round, the re-releases, is that languishing in 3rd place with 3 points is Pro Boxing Simulator. 2nd place with 7 points is Ghostbusters. And in 1st place with 8 points, just winning by a nose, is Park Patrol. So that's 2 rounds in a row to Firebird making a storming comeback in this final episode. Okay, so here we are, the final round, round 16 of the Commodore 64 Budget Publisher Showdown, and this is the wildcard round. For this round, we've picked the best game from each publisher that didn't fit any of the other categories, so this is something that falls into a slightly different genre than any of the others that we've covered, but we consider to be the best game based on personal opinion or review scores, or a bit of both. So, for this round, we've got representing Mastertronic Kickstart 2, Representing Firebird is Thrust, and for Codemasters it's Tilt. So let's begin this final round with Mastertronic's offering Kickstart 2, complete with Course Designer. This was a 1987 release in the Mastertronic packaging for £1.99. The game was of course coded by Sean Southern for Mr. Chip Software, the fourth Mastertronic game in this series to be programmed by him, and this time he was assisted by Andrew Morris on the graphics and title screen. Experience yet more of the thrills and spills of dirt bike racing in this new improved all-action simulation designed for 1 or 2 players. Against the clock, guide your rider over 24 different courses, keeping a careful lookout for the numerous hazards and obstacles that will come your way. And when you've mastered the 24 included courses, you can create your own with the built-in course designer. The game was highly praised by the magazines. Zap gave it 86%, with reviewer Julian Rignall saying Kickstart 2 is extremely well thought out, offering 2-player simultaneous action, a brilliant computer opponent and an excellent screen designer for only £2. How can you resist? And Commodore user gave it 8 out of 10, with Ferdy Hamilton saying, without trying to sound too much like a dog with a whopping meaty brand new butcher's bone, I simply cannot put this game down for too long. I mean, this is a classic, isn't it? Well, I'll come out and say it straight away. This is probably the best budget game ever released, in my opinion. It's got great presentation, loads of options at the beginning on the title screen. You can pick courses or you can randomly choose courses. 1 or 2 players, obviously. You've got a nice graphic title screen as well, and the music's pretty good as well on that title screen. In terms of the gameplay, it's easy to pick up what you've got to do, but it's hard to master. You've got to learn the correct speed and approach for all the different obstacles. Also, timing and reflexes are quite important as well for jumping over some of the obstacles and things like that. The in-game graphics are good. Obviously the background objects are fairly static as you'd expect, but they're nicely drawn. But what's really good is the animation on the bike and also the player sprite as you do the wheelies and come flying off and things like that. The music is obviously taken from the Kickstart TV show. Don't think the game was officially connected to that, but I like that they used it anyway. It's got sound effects as well. They're fairly simple, but they do the job. You've got engine noises from the motorbike and sort of whooping noises as you fall off or as you do the big wheelies and things like that. If I'm going to level a criticism at it, and there aren't really many, I suppose you could say that some of the course designs are a little bit silly, as you end up barely participating if you fall off and it can't find a place to put you back on them. Also, the opponent isn't really penalised enough for some mistakes, so if you do a course perfectly but a little bit slow, and the opponent goes quite quickly and falls off, they can still finish the course before you can. So you could say that's a little bit of an issue, but we're talking really minor nitpicking here. If it wasn't good enough as it was as a game, you've also got the course designer, which means you can make as many different level layouts as you like and play them against your friends. You can save them and load them. It could be a bit more user-friendly, the course designer. You could have used the joystick to select objects and left and right to scroll the course and fire to place objects maybe, but it's still pretty easy to use. So you put it all together, custom course selection, 2-player mode and a course designer. You've got endless replay value and it costs £1.99. I mean, this could have been a mad release for £2.99 easily, and it puts many full price releases to shame as well. So for me, I made this first place in my Mastertronic Top 10 Originals video many years ago. It's absolutely the best original game you could get at budget price, I think. But what do you two think?
Now, I borrowed the original game from somebody at school back in the day. I think it was possibly the original Mr. Chip version as well, before Mastertronic picked it up and re-released it. And my brother and I quite liked it. I mean, you got the tie-in to the Kickstart TV series, even though, yes, as you note, it wasn't actually officially licensed. It probably didn't borrow too much that you would have had the BBC lawyers knocking at the door to say, hang on, why haven't you licensed this? Despite the music and the theme of the actual game itself. So we quite enjoyed that. So when the sequel came out, obviously picked that up, and yeah, it is another stone cold classic. And there isn't a massive amount to add. You've got a course designer where you can literally build your own fiendish contraptions, and the 2-player mode meant my brother and I could fire it up and challenge each other. He had slightly less patience than myself, I will say, for working some of this stuff out. He's probably better now he's a lot older, to be fair. The sound of falling off, the whee, is probably embedded in my brain somewhere for all eternity, because he heard it so often when he got negotiating one of the obstacles ever so slightly wrong. Yeah, if there are any criticisms, I see it as a nod to early unintentional speed running, where falling off can get you through the course quicker than actually doing it legitimately. So I can only say that 86% in Zap was possibly a little harsh. There is so much you can do. You got 24 courses and an infinite number you can build, and what's more to say?
Yeah, I've just looked up actually the score that they gave the first game as well, and they gave the first game 90%. So to give the second game, which is all the first game's got, plus better graphics and the course designer, and they gave it a lower score, seems a little bit scandalous, I would say. Andrew, what are your thoughts on Kickstart 2?
Well, I'm going to go off on a tangent here and talk about the whole series of games, because Kickstart 2 is effectively the third part in a series of 5 games, and people are going to be scratching their heads and trying to work that one out. It actually started off on the Commodore 16, and that is a very different game. Sean had played Superbike, an arcade game, and that had your motorbike jumping over obstacles and collecting balloons for points, and that's what the Commodore 16 version was. And years later, Jason Kelk, sadly now no longer with us, created a Commodore 64 conversion of that C16 game on cartridge for RGCD, which is now very collectible. And when Sean moved over to the C64, he came up with a new scrolling routine and was able to split the screen, leading to the more racing-oriented Kickstart. Then following Kickstart 2 came Super Scramble Simulator for Gremlin, and that was a more ambitious version with just a single player and then a separate overhead view of the course. It wasn't generally as well received as Kickstart 2. And the other little curiosity in the series is Kickstart 128. That was disc only for the Commodore 128, which featured a different set of courses and some new obstacles. And again, years later, clever Commodore 64 hackers have made a C64 version of that you can play standalone. I actually played Kickstart 2 before I played Kickstart 1, and obviously the biggest improvement for me is the fact you have the speedometer on screen all the time. So once you know how fast you can go over a particular obstacle, then you can master the courses much easier. And all in all, it's an amazing series from Sean Southern and Andrew Morris, and still very playable even today.
Thanks for the history lesson. I did not know about all these different versions of the game, so that was interesting to know. I'll have to check some of those out.
Andrew touched upon the cartridge version that RGCD put out of Kickstart C16. I believe there's actually 2 different box versions of it as well. There was a giant red clam and I think a normal cardboard box version. Now I've got the clam version, but as he notes, both of them are actually quite hard to find nowadays because they were one of the earlier releases that they did.
Yes, James moved from that clamshell to printed cardboard boxes, and I have the printed cardboard box, Kickstart C16 as well. And I must say, if you open the package, you can still smell the printer ink.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for all that information about the other games in the series, and we'll find some links to content that you can go to look into those and put those in the comments of this video. So let's move on to the next game now then, with the Firebird offering for this wildcard round. Thrust, released in 1986 in the Silver Range packaging for £1.99. Thrust was created by Jeremy Smith with music from Rob Hubbard. The Resistance is about to launch a major offensive against the Intergalactic Empire. In preparation for this, they have captured several battle-grade starships, but they lack the essential power sources for these formidable craft, Klystron pods. You've been commissioned by the Resistance to steal these pods from the Empire's storage planets. The game was universally acclaimed by the magazines, with Zap giving it an overall score of 94%, saying it's the most enjoyable game we've played for ages and at the price you'd be silly to miss it. Computer and Video Games awarded it a CMVG hit with a value score of 10 and a playability score of 9, saying Thrust is a simple but totally addictive game, and at $1.99 you'd be stupid not to add it to your collection. Commodore user gave it the maximum score of 5 out of 5 for value and staying power and awarded it their cheaper of the month, while your Commodore also awarded it 10 out of 10 for value but mistakenly printed that the game was published by Mastertronic rather than Firebird. So great reviews from all the magazines, but what do we think of Thrust? Andrew?
Well, Thrust is inspired by Atari's arcade game Gravatar and uses a similar vector graphic style, although on the C64 it's not actually vector graphics, it's all plotted into a bitmap. The aim is to descend into a series of caverns, pick up the energy orb and escape. And if you survive the first 6 levels, you then move on to levels with reverse gravity. If you manage to survive that, you move on to the same 6 levels again, but with invisible walls. And then the next 6 have invisible walls and reverse gravity. And one trick is shooting the nuclear reactor will stop the energy to the guns for a short while so you can get past them. And I must say, this is one of my favourite budget games of all time. I just love the graphic style of it, the incredible Rob Hubbard soundtrack, and even today, it's an incredibly playable game, and it's one I've gone back to over the years and still play now.
Okay, thanks Andrew. What are your thoughts about Thrust, Matt? Similar or different?
Well, what can I say about Thrust that hasn't already been said about Thrust? Thrust started out like a number of other games such as Elite and Exile on the BBC and was converted over to the 64, and obviously gained quite something with the Rob Hubbard soundtrack on the title screen, even though it got interrupted every time the demo kicked in. Starting off the game, it takes a little bit of practice to getting used to. Once you are there, then it is very difficult to put down. The gravity and the physics about flying around just feel right. If you crash, it's generally your fault. You've overthrusted or failed to thrust in time. Sometimes you get shot and it seems a little unfair because the guns have got a little bit of a random aim to them, and you could play exactly the same scenario again and not get shot. It's got risk and reward about shooting the nuclear power station into critical, and then you've got 10 seconds to exit before the planet blows up. But if you get out in time, then you get extra bonus points. And like Andrew says, it is not only one of the greatest budget games of all time, it's one of the greatest Commodore 64 games of all time. And quite frankly, Firebird could have sold it for full price and it still would have gained the reviews that it did.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention it about being a full price game, because the BBC Micro version was a full price game and certainly sold particularly well. That's the version I was most used to when I was a kid, because I had a BBC Micro at home, and I was certainly more familiar with that version than the Commodore 64 one. I probably passed over it first time around simply because I'd already played it on the Beeb, but it was an absolute steal at £1.99. There's no argument about that. The graphics, you could say they're simplistic in terms of the vector style, and they're not as vibrant as the BBC version because the palette on the C64 was not quite as colourful as the Beeb was, but they're really nice graphics. They fit the game perfectly, obviously inspired by Gravitor, as Andrew said. I do like the game. I find it's very hard. Even after the first few stages, it takes a lot of trial and error, and it's a game, but it's so well programmed in terms of the physics that, it's almost like a tech demo in some respects. Controlling the ship, very tricky, but as you said, Matt, the implementation of the physics is so good that you don't really feel cheated when you do crash. You've thrusted too much or not enough when you crash into the walls. And as we've also said, it does offer some flexibility in the play style, because you could just blow up the planet and not collect the pod on some stages if you want to, or you can get the pod and not blow up the planet, or you can try and do both to get the most points. I do feel it would benefit from a slightly less steep difficulty curve, but there's no doubt it's an excellent budget game, and overall I rated it 4th in my Firebird top 10. So there's a few games I like more than it, but that's mainly down to the difficulty rather than the quality of the game.
It's interesting you mentioned the gravity, the physics engine behind it, from a time when we didn't really think about that sort of thing. Matt mentioned Exile, another BBC game, coincidentally, which involved Jeremy Smith, co-author of Thrust, and Exile takes it to the next level, because not only do you have the gravity as you fly around on a jetpack, you also have objects falling under their own weight. You have water, fire, you have all sorts of effects in that game, building on the ideas in Thrust. And I think that's a Commodore 64 game that more people should check out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not one I've checked out on the C64. I played it a bit on the BBC Micro, but it came out a little bit towards the end of the time where that was my preferred computer and I'd actually moved to the C64. So yeah, I have missed out on playing that, but it is one I would like to explore more.
It's very, very fitting, but somebody ported Thrust to the Vectrex in the early 2000s, and, the Vectrex is a vector machine, so needless to say, the graphics fit right in. There's an AY, very good interpretation of Rob Hubbard's title track as well. You also have some extra modes in there. You have a high score challenge. There is more to the game than even the Firebird and original versions add, and technically, it is, in my opinion, the definitive version of Thrust. The game's so popular, it's even got a port on the Atari 2600, and the joystick controls actually work relatively well, although you can use the foot pedal controller that you could get for driving games. There is a version that will actually work with that for additional controls instead of just the joystick. So Thrust is such a popular and well-received game that it's had some crazy and brilliant ports away from the home computer formats.
Yeah, as you say, it's lived in memory for a lot of people and even gone back to systems that were more primitive than the ones it was made on originally. So certainly a very influential game, as well as games that have been coming out for many years afterwards that were inspired by it. Okay, so we all agree Thrust was a brilliant game. Let's move on to the final game in this round, the Codemasters offering, which is Tilt, released in 1990 and costing £2.99. This game was coded by Stephen Walters with music from Steve Barrett, and the aim of the game is to use the joystick to manoeuvre a maze to guide a ball through it and into a hole. Unfortunately, if the ball hits any of the walls en route, you'll have to start again, which means that the energy used on the previous tilts is wasted. There are a number of gates on each screen which you must open by pressing the fire button at the right moment, and as the game progresses, the ball gradually gets bigger, giving you less margin for error on manoeuvring. The magazines were fairly complimentary on this one, with Zap giving it 74% and saying Tilt is quite an original and playable little game. It's also technically very impressive with a solid 3D maze moving quickly and smoothly. And your Commodore gave the game 4 out of 5, saying it's good stuff in a mindless sort of way and is a laugh for a few mates on a wet Sunday evening.
And Commodore Format gave it 93%, as witnessed on the front cover.
Yes, absolutely. I should have mentioned that. So, final game of this round, this episode, and the competition overall, Tilt. Matt, what are your thoughts on it?
Now, Tilt's an interesting game. There aren't many games of that sort of ilk. The old get your ball around the maze, avoiding holes and hazards. The guy who programmed it, Stephen Walters, developed quite a robust pseudo 3D perspective engine. He used it for Tilt, he did a pinball game for Mastertronic, and he also wrote pool and snooker games for Zeppelin. And if you've not played either of those two, then you really do need to check them out because they are both excellent. The graphics and the perspective and just the realism about everything moving around is excellent, and the speed to go with it, it's hard to actually think that, it's actually coming out of the Commodore, considering how well we know that sort of 3D calculation and perspective has never gone down particularly well on the machine, say, to compare to the Spectrum. Unfortunately, Stephen passed away about 10 years ago, I discovered quite recently, and when you think about how old programmers tended to be back then, which was probably about the same age as you and I when we were buying the games, he must have passed away at not a particularly old age at all, sadly. As for the game, it is rock hard. You need a real sturdy joystick and some steel nerves and quite good reactions to be able to even get through the first screen. Your longevity is really going to depend on how masochistic you are. I think Commodore Format's review was probably a little too enthusiastic, but on the other hand, I think Zap's score was a bit mean. So my personal view on the game is probably somewhere in between.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that pinball game. I've just looked that up. That is one of the best pinball games on the Commodore 64 and was in my top 10 Mastertronic games. That's a really good interpretation of pinball with some pretty realistic feeling sort of physics for the movement of the ball. So it doesn't surprise me actually that it was done by the same programmer. This game, for me, the first thing you get is the look of the cover. The box art on this is just awful. I don't know what they were doing here, but they've just put this nerdy character on the front with absolutely no indication of what the game's about. So I'm not a fan of that. But beyond that, this is a game I'd not really played before. I actually really enjoyed it, despite it being rock hard, as you said. The first thing you've got to mention about it is the controls, which are absolutely spot on in terms of controlling the movement of the maze. And I feel like it makes your digital joystick, your Competition Pro or your Zip Stick, feel like an analog stick. It's that good when you're moving it from left to right that it really feels almost like a PlayStation analog controller. The movement of the maze, as you said, it's a really good 3D movement of the maze. It's smooth and it's also realistic with the inertia on it. The sound effects are pretty simple, but they're effective. They fit the game really well. As you said, it's rock hard. The first time I played this, it took me about 5 attempts to even beat the first screen. Eventually you kind of click to how the controls work, and once you do, it's a really good test of skill, reactions and nerve. It's got a few tricks to boost your score. It is a high score challenge type game ultimately. It's got the multiplier for all the gates that you pass when completing the stage, so the more gates you pass in one go and complete the stage, you get more points. I do feel like there should have been points awarded for the remaining power, because there is the potential to just get the same score every single game. It does need tons of practice and it can be really frustrating. I feel like one addition that would have made it better was be a password system so that you can skip the earlier screens, because it does get annoying having to play the same ones over and over again. Or maybe a practice mode so you could try a screen that you've got to independently of actually playing the game, just to try and get your head around it. But I have to say this was one of the best games I've played that I'd never played before, so a really enjoyable game and a pleasant surprise for me, this one.
that nerdy kid on the front of the cover is actually Roger Frames, the pseudo character who reviewed budget games for Commodore format.
Ah, okay. I don't think I ever read Commodore format very much, so I don't remember that character. But yeah, awful box art. But aside from that, the game's pretty good, I thought. Andrew, you want to bring us home on the final round here and let us know your thoughts about Tilt?
Well, I must admit, I did see the box in my local Software Plus in Cambridge, and I saw Roger Frames from the pages of Commodore format on there and the It's a Corker, and I hadn't actually read the review yet, so I was thinking, is that a bit presumptuous? Is that official? So I didn't buy it that day, but then I did read the review, and I thought, I've missed one there, so I'll have to pick that up sometime. And I never did. It was only when Commodore format then put it on their own cover tape that I played it. And I love this game. It's a really good game. Stephen Walters, as has been mentioned, was a very clever programmer with the C64. He also did Bully's Sporting Darts for Alternative, which is my favourite darts game on the system. Very sad to hear that he passed away some time ago. I didn't realise that. And Tilt is literally a digital version of one of those little handheld toys where you try and move a steel ball around a maze. It feels superb when you control it. There's a real inertia to the ball, so you have to learn to control the speed. Those little speed traps, they turn white if you're going too fast, they turn black when you're not, so you do have to push back to slow down and then go over them. And as you play through the levels, more and more of those are added in place of gates, so it gets tougher and tougher. I love the way the rollers appear and scroll the new maze into view. I think that's a very clever touch. Just something as simple as the way the shadow on the ball moves as you rotate the maze is so well done. I mean, I nearly made this my winner, not to spoil the scores that are coming up, because I liked it so much, and I found this a really hard round to score because I love all three games and they all have so much replayability.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about the rollers, but yeah, that's a lovely touch, isn't it? The way it moves one maze out of the play area and then a new one in. And again, it's got some great sound effects to go along with that.
I do just want to add, there was another game called Tilt around at the same time from Italian software house Genius, which again featured a marble being rolled around a maze, but that's more of a confusion Gutang style logic game where you have to shuffle the tiles that the marble rolls around on, and it was quite amusing seeing the two magazines mix the games up.
Yeah.
I mean, the only other game that has been released that is kind of like that is Carl Ornell's recent Graviton. Those are the only two that I can really think of prominently that are of that ilk.
Yeah, it's absolutely a unique game for its time and really well implemented. It could have gone very badly, but it's absolutely perfect in the implementation, even if it is really, really, really hard. Well, that rounds off the final round of this epic competition. So let's get on to the rankings for the wildcard round. And I'm going to go first on this one. These are all really excellent games, especially for the price. They all require to learn the mechanics and put in a lot of practice to get good at them. You really have to spend some time with them, which again makes them great value. But I've got to rank them. And in third place, I'm going to go with Tilt. It's the one I've played the least and I'm still getting to grips with it. I recognise it's a brilliant game, but I just can't rank it higher than the other two, to be honest. And in second place, I'm going to go with Thrust, a really well-programmed game and playable, but also really hard. And in first place, there was never going to be any doubt for me, really. Kickstart 2, quite simply the best budget game ever released, in my opinion. So, Andrew, what are your rankings for this final round?
Well, as I said, this was a really tough round to evaluate the three different games, which are all, as you say, really well made, really well implemented. So many aspects of them are perfect. But with 1 point, we have Tilt from Codemasters, which is still great fun. I could pick that up any day and play that. With 2 points going to Kickstart 2, just superb game, particularly playing it head-to-head against someone else, and so much extra value from the built-in course designer. And that means it's 3 points for Firebird and Thrust. It's a classic, and I love it.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And finally then, Matt, you get to bring home the final scores of this final round. What are your rankings for these three games?
It's quite a round to finish off the entire series. I mean, I will stress that the game I'm placing in third here is still better than probably 90% of the other games that have been reviewed across this entire series. So with 1 point is Tilt. As I said, still a brilliant game, but not compared to the other two. In second place is Kickstart 2, and in first place with 3 points is Thrust, which is in my top 20 Commodore 64 games of all time. And it's possibly the only budget game that's in there, maybe Spore as well. That shows the quality of a budget title.
Yeah, absolutely. They were all top-notch games in this final round. Unfortunately, we can't give them all equal points because that wouldn't be any fun, would it? So let's go to the scores for that final round. And in third place with 3 points is Tilt. In second place with 7 points is Kickstart 2. And winning this final round for Firebird with 8 points is Thrust. So now, after 5 episodes and 16 rounds where myself and 8 different Commodore 64 enthusiasts have looked at a total of 48 games, it's now time to announce the final standings of the Commodore 64 Budget Publisher Showdown. This will give as definitive an answer as is reasonably possible as to which company gave us the best budget games for the system. We'll skip the leaderboard for now and go straight to the podium. And in third place, with 93 points, is Codemasters. In second place with 96 points is Firebird, and that means that the winner with 99 points is Mastertronic.
And the crowd go wild.
Okay, so, well, let's just talk about that first. The result, what do we think? Is it deserved? It's obviously very close between the 3 companies. Do you think overall that Mastertronic stand out just by an edge as the best?
Well, I did say that I felt Mastertronic would win overall, and that's been shown by the result here at the end. I think they do have the edge in terms of the number of original games, and I do think they have the edge in some respects in terms of quality. I didn't realise it was going to be that close. There's 1 or 2 results there that could have changed it completely, and even the results in that last round there was so close between those 3 games. And as we say, those are all 3 quality games people should try if they haven't before.
Yeah, it was really close in the end. Matt, your thoughts on the final results?
I did say at the start I thought it would be really, really close, and that has been borne out. I will agree with Andrew that I think the sheer number of games that Mastertronic put out probably helped it in terms of assessment here, because there was a bigger pool of games to actually pick from, not necessarily because there were actually more quality games. Let's face it, we've all picked up the odd duff title, and Mastertronic had more than its fair share. Bionic Granny, anybody? So its sheer number of titles probably helped it here in terms of the pool of good games that it actually had to draw upon compared to the other 2 publishers. I thought Firebird might just squeak it. They've come second, which isn't too bad, but all 3 publishers in general put out a great deal of quality games, so everybody's a winner, as Hot Chocolate sang.
Yeah, in the end, you're right. It just shows that all these 3 publishers were pretty decent. Yes, they had almost as many bad games as good ones, but across the board in different categories, it's been proven that all 3 did some brilliant games. So let's just quickly take a look at the scoreboard for this episode, and you can see that Codemasters really struggled in this episode. They ended up with 11 points in third place. Mastertronic got 18 points, and Firebird were the big winners of this final episode. They actually got 25 out of a possible 27 points. You know, that's the most points that could be got from 3 rounds. So that's a really impressive comeback considering that they were 10 points behind coming into this final episode. So Firebird had a bit of a duffer in a couple of previous episodes, but really pulled it out of the bag in this final one. Okay, so as with all the other episodes, I've got a few questions just to finish off with. Firstly, are there any games from the 3 publishers that you would have chosen instead of the ones I did for the categories we've covered today? In this case, obviously one of those rounds was a wildcard round, so if there's any other games that you think were noteworthy that weren't covered in other categories, please mention those as well.
There's probably not many I would have swapped out for something else across this episode. I might have picked Roll Around instead of Mind Trap for Mastertronic. I did quite like that back in the day. It was kind of like a sort of a puzzle marble madness, and it had a very catchy title tune, and it got good reviews in Commodore format and Zap in the 80s, I think. Super Pipeline 2 for the Mastertronic re-release. I mean, that is arguably Taskset's finest hour, and it is just a ludicrously daft, engrossing game that I just absolutely play to death. And a bit of a left field thing, Turbo the Tortoise for re-release on Codemasters, because it was technically released by High-Tech before they went into liquidation. The High-Tech releases, especially on disc, are somewhat hard to find now. Ask Andrew, he bought a copy from me.
Yeah, those are all 3 excellent games, which are decent candidates for replacing the ones that were chosen. Andrew, have you got any other picks that you would have chosen as alternatives?
Well, for a Codemasters wildcard, I would go with Super Seymour Saves the Planet. I mean, Seymour originally came about as a character as a replacement for Dizzy, and just like Dizzy had its own spin-off arcade games, and for me, Super Seymour Saves the Planet is the best of those games. And Super Seymour is a superb take on the bomb jack formula. You jump around the screen collecting barrels of nuclear waste, trying to clean up the planet. The controls are brilliant, and despite one or two little bugs, it's just a superb score-chasing game. Recently played it in the Retro League online competition, and I managed to loop the game, complete all 16 stages, and that's a game I really enjoy. I have to echo what Matt said. If we're looking at other re-releases, Super Pipeline 2 for Mastertronic and Turbo the Tortoise for Codemasters, because, again, two excellent games, great fun, both have really good graphics and great to pick up and play. Although what's interesting is that the Mastertronic release just called it Pipeline 2 rather than Super Pipeline 2.
Yeah, I did always wonder about that. That does confuse things a little bit. With Turbo the Tortoise, I did seriously consider that for the re-releases, and it would have given the other two a pretty good run for the money, although it still would have come third, I think. The main reason I didn't was because I was more thinking of re-releases as a re-release of a full-price game rather than one that had already been released at budget price, so that was kind of my reasoning behind that. I've actually got one as well that I might have included, an alternative to what I did choose, which is the Firebird game Collapse, which didn't really fall into any of the categories very well. It's sort of a puzzle game. It's sort of a platform game. It is my number one Firebird original personally, but I couldn't in good conscience put it above Thrust in the wildcard round, which is perhaps where it would have sat. So while I do enjoy the game, and I personally think it's better than Thrust, I think I would have been hung out to dry if I hadn't included Thrust in this competition somewhere. But I would definitely recommend it if you've not played it. It's an excellent game. My second question that I always ask, which one game from the ones we've reviewed would you say is must play? And I would say this is the hardest of all the choices of any episode so far. Andrew?
I am going to pick Park Patrol as my must-play for this. I think it's one that was a little overlooked at the time, despite the high score from Zap, and I don't think it sold in particularly large numbers either. It's a very creative game. I love the environmental theme, the choice of a boy or girl ranger, and it's such a fun game to discover things. That's something that attracts me to a game. Can you discover little secrets, little mechanics, little ways of playing? Then you can go back to it again and work on improving your score, getting further in the game.
Absolutely. That was on my must-play list, but now you've chosen it, I can choose something else. But first, Matt, what's your choice for the must-play game?
Ooh, choices. Very difficult choices, but got to be Thrust. Pretty much enough said on that one, so I'll pass it back to you, Matt.
Thanks. Well, because neither of you have said it, I can't really say anything other than Kickstart 2. It's the best budget game of all time for me. It's got so much replayability value, the construction kit, 2-player mode, tricky controls that take some time to master, but when you do, then you just get so much fun out of it. So yeah, Kickstart 2 for me would be the must-play game. I'm sure most people watching this have played all three of those, and if they haven't, then they should go and do so straight away. So the final question then, and this is a different question because I can't obviously ask you who you think is going to win, although it would be an easy answer now. So instead, I've got a final question, which is, were there any other budget publishers on the Commodore 64 that could potentially dethrone our winner Mastertronic? We've looked at the three biggest publishers, but there were several publishers that did a good range of games for the C64. So does anyone stand out as a possible challenger?
Difficult one to assess. I mean, those three are obviously the biggest and obviously put out the most. So there are a number of other notable publishers who did produce an awful lot of very good games. You're looking at such publishers as Zeppelin, Racket, which was Pewson's budget label, or High Tech. But I think for all three of them, and especially High Tech, mainly due to the plethora of cartoon license games, I don't think there would have been enough games across all the different genres that were being covered here. You'd need to sit down and dissect it out of all their releases. So if you were going to look at any of those three, you probably would have had to have narrowed down the number of genres being looked at to make it a more fair contest.
Yeah, and that's obviously why I picked the three biggest ones. Andrew, any thoughts on any other publishers or any comments about the ones that Matt mentioned?
I personally have a soft spot for Zeppelin. They published one of my favourite games of all time, Zybex. I do think that Alternative might just have had enough games to cover all the categories here. There's some very good games on there, but they also published some really bad games, so much like Mastertronic then. I would also put in a shout for Players. They don't get as much attention as the others, but if you look at games like Joe Blade, Galdrigan's Domain, the many Carl Hornell releases, there were some good fun titles among them.
Yeah, good call. I also thought of Zeppelin. They were the one that stood out as a real challenger with the likes of Zybex, Draconis, Arnie. They did a lot of sports games, and also Titanic Blinky is a game that I discovered fairly recently that I really enjoy as well. As Matt said, I don't think any of the others had quite the range of genres, so it wasn't going to work in such a large multi-episode format. But who knows, maybe sometime in the future we'll pit Mastertronic against one of those publishers in the categories that they can be compared on.
Andrew mentioned Players there. Players was the budget label for Interceptor Micros. Galdrigan's Domain was actually a re-release, so it would at least fitted into one of the genres being looked at, if nothing else. They also did, I think, a somewhat overlooked Gunsmoke clone called Outlaws, which is actually really, really playable and a hell of a lot better than the turgid mess that US Gold released conversion-wise when they actually had the proper license.
Sure, yeah, and probably a better candidate for a Wild West game than Wild West Seymour as well, I imagine. Okay, well, I think that rounds things off quite nicely. All that remains is me to thank you both for participating and bringing this final episode home. I hope you both enjoyed it. Are there any final words from either of you before we bring proceedings to a close?
Well, thanks for the invite and the chance to be involved. I thoroughly enjoyed looking back at some of these great budget games. I'm really enjoying the series as a whole. I'd just like to plug my involvement in Zap 64 and Zap Amiga, my homebrew column in Retro Gamer, which covers lots of formats as well as the latest C64 games, and c64books.co.uk for more news on my latest projects.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and we'll put links to all of that content where applicable in the video comments so that people can check that out. Matt, any final words from you?
Not much more than what Andrew has said. Anybody interested in reviews at Zap and features and freebies on the cover disc and exclusives should sign up for the Patreon at the time of this episode going out. Issue 8 should be on the shelves for Zap 64, which should have reviews for Tenabra and The Machinations, amongst others. As for myself, that is pretty much all of that I work on, apart from helping my daughter grow up. And it's just been a pleasure being invited to take part in this, and I found it quite fun, actually. This is really the first kind of podcast that I've actually got myself involved with, bizarrely enough. And yeah, I've really enjoyed it, so I might be tempted to do more in the future.
Okay, well, I might hold you to that if I end up doing something else, so appreciate it. That's the end of the Commodore 64 Budget Publisher Showdown, and after very close competition, it's Mastertronic that has come out on top. That said, it would only have taken a couple of slightly different rankings during the series, and it could easily have been a three-way tie, so I think we've proved that these publishers were quite evenly matched. Interestingly, when you look across all 16 rounds, Mastertronic actually had the lowest number of first place finishes of the three publishers, but the highest number of second place spots. So you could probably say that while the games weren't always the best in class, they were slightly more consistent than the other two. Please leave a comment and let us know what you think of this episode and the final outcome. And if you enjoyed the roundtable discussion format of this series, then please let me know so I can consider whether to do more videos of this style in the future. The competition may be over, but that's not quite all from this series. I have some content that was cut from some of the 5 recordings for the series, so I plan to release those as a bonus episode, and who knows, there may be more to come from this series in the future too. I'll also be creating a playlist featuring all the episodes, so you can relive this competition in full if you wish to. Once again, a huge thank you to Andrew, Matt and all the other guests that featured in the earlier episodes for taking the time to play and talk about these games, and also thanks to all of you that have watched the series and left comments, as that helps make it worth all the effort involved. Of course, I'll be continuing to create interesting retro gaming content and plan to launch another new series very soon, so please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks very much for watching, and bye for now.